Welcome all to Tata Literature Live, Authors Lounge, where we discuss the brightness of books. The brightness of books being something we thought of as throwing a bit of light in this dark world we are living in at the moment. Today, the book we are discussing is a departure from the literary work that we normally look at, and is something which is absolutely immediate and something which is consuming our thoughts. It's about the coronavirus, and the title of the book is The Coronavirus: What You Need to Know About the Global Pandemic. The authors are Maherra Desai, clinical psychologist and medical researcher who's right there on the screen. Dr. Rajesh Parikh will be joining us. He's director of medical research, Jaslow Hospital, and a neuropsychiatrist. And Dr. Anil Parikh, practicing physician and internal medicine specialist, who unfortunately couldn't be with us today. Maherra, there's a sentence of yours which I read, which partly goes like this. The situation we are in was inevitable. We have had multiple unheeded warnings. And I think when you're talking about that, you're not just talking of the coronavirus 2019, but of many viruses which had gone before. Am I right?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, like what? Where were these warnings about which previous viruses did we have warnings which were ignored? What has humanity not done, in other words?
So what I will start off with is specific to the coronavirus. Right since we had the SARS and the MERS outbreaks in 2002, research has been ongoing to understand them, and multiple research has been published, one specifically by Mr. Winsing Cheng and his colleagues, where they mentioned that this is like a ticking time bomb, and if we do not change human behavior and our ways, we are going to fall into trouble. Now, that was specifically with respect to the coronavirus, but we see this with climate change, we see this with other diseases, and constantly it's just a few experts within those fields who are pursuing those goals, whereas the larger governances are taking care of more immediate economic responsibilities. And a lot of, whether we're looking at the tsunamis increasing, the earthquakes increasing, or diseases like this in the form of small invisible viruses putting our lives at hold, I really feel that we haven't listened so far, and this can be a really changing moment in our lives. Where are we going to pause? We are definitely going to emerge stronger from this pandemic, but are we going to be wiser as well? Are we going to learn from everything that we hadn't so far?
Yeah. Are you also suggesting that the world leaders, I'm not talking of our country, I'm just talking of world leaders in general, and particularly in the West, that they put economic considerations above health considerations, that they delayed taking any action, closing down like we have in India, much too late, because they wanted the economy not to shut.
Yes, absolutely. And specifically, I can even mention that it's in the news, it's everywhere, whether you're looking at the United States, which has the brightest experts, the leading scientists, a major number of Nobel laureates come from there. And still, they seem so unprepared because the ones taking the decisions, and Donald Trump has not been afraid to say this, that he wanted the economy back up. And even now, as their numbers seem to contribute to almost 30% of the global numbers, that still seems to be the priority and focus. And we're fortunate that I feel in India, we took the steps early on with relatively fewer numbers. We have other nations like South Korea, or even China for that matter, although they reacted late, they shut their governances completely and economy was put aside. And they moved forward with controlling the health, because if you have the health and the livelihood in place, then the economy does take a short-term hit, but eventually it's going to come back stronger.
Yeah, now we have seen this quite visibly, the conflict between Dr. Fauci in the United States and President Trump. They've contradicted each other on screen, more or less at the same time. I think that kind of encapsulates the problem that the leaders were not listening to the, the scientists. And me, shall I start with good news or bad news? The good news is, and contradict me if all this is fake news, the Singapore University has given a data-driven prediction, which has just come on my phone about an hour ago. And it says that the according to data which they've analyzed, uh, 97% of the infections the world will have gone by May 29. And in India, 97%, I don't know why this figure of 97% will have gone around May 15th. And they've given figures for each country. They've analyzed about 115 countries, and you can log on to that. And you will find the figures for each country. But May seems to be the time when the whole thing starts tapering off quite dramatically. The bad news is something I read today, that Italian scientists have said that the virus can attach itself to dust particles and therefore can be airborne. So a polluted place, particularly like, let's say, Delhi, uh, this virus can attach itself to these dust particles and then float around. Now, whether those retain their infectivity or not, we don't know, and they don't know either. Any reactions on that?
Yes, can you hear me? Because
yes, indeed. You're live.
I'm getting a lot of echo coming on the...
Yeah, please proceed. We hear you very clearly.
All right. So if I kind of understood what you said, Anil, because I missed it in pieces, the issue was a new study, and the good news was that it seems to indicate that the virus or the epidemic will come down sometime by the end of next month.
Yeah.
And the Italian study about the dust. But, long ago, preceding that, and we have talked about it in our book, was the Wells evaporation curve. Now, what this tells us is that as a droplet falls, drawn down by gravity, depending on other variables, the most obvious of them being heat and wind, it starts evaporating. So much before it hits the ground, it can actually become much lighter and then become airborne. And it doesn't necessarily need to have dust particles that you alluded to from the Italian study for it to move around. I believe it's still a bit premature for us to exult over any kind of good news that comes in. Of course, we need to look at it seriously, but at the same time, it should not lull us into a false sense of security to believe that it will just go away, thanks to heat and other factors. If I may add to something, there have been two studies from MIT which seem to support the Singapore hypothesis, though not from the same angle, from prismatically from another angle that seems to support it. One is a study that came up about maybe 3 days ago, in which they looked at the virus in vitro in a test tube or a petri dish and saw how long it survives under various temperatures. And it seemed to indicate that beyond 35 degrees, it survives for less than an hour. MIT also published a paper 3 weeks ago, which would have again made us feel as happy as the Singapore study does. And in that, what they did is they looked at the epidemic, not the virus, but the epidemic. And they looked at its point prevalence in different areas in the world. And that seemed to indicate that in warmer temperatures, it wasn't as prevalent as it was in lower temperatures. Now, the moment we read the paper, within an hour actually, I entered into a correspondence with the authors in Boston. And they replied a few hours later when it was morning on the Eastern Coast. And what I pointed out to them is that you are looking at how the virus has behaved under certain conditions. But your paper focuses on viral behavior while entirely ignoring human behavior. And the disease is an interaction between viral and human behavior. And they had also anticipated specifically that in countries like India, with the onset of heat, perhaps the epidemic would abate a bit. And then I pointed out to them that, well, with the onset of summer and the monsoons, human behavior too changes. The moment it rains in India, people tend to aggregate at bus stops, sometimes, in slums, in the first house, the doors are always open, people get together, they come actually much closer. The ventilation reduces because they shut the door. And so human behavior is moving in the opposite direction. And we don't know at what point these two forces might neutralize each other, or one might overwhelm the other. And they graciously conceded and said, yes, this is a very important perspective. We were looking purely at viral behavior, but there are other factors which could change our projections.
Right. Maherra, do you want to come in?
Sure. So yes, we may finish with also the first wave, and although that is definitely good news, and things should settle down a bit. But I think it's also very important to remember that we still don't have a vaccine or a cure available for this virus. So it is likely to, until we get a vaccine in place, our behavior needs to change for a long time, because we can anticipate, and it's already being anticipated, that there will be a second wave of the virus. Like we in China, in Singapore, they did manage to get it under control, and their first peak, so to say, of the virus did come down. But now they are seeing re-emerging infections as soon as they started opening up the economies a little bit. So that is something that we need to watch out for and be careful about. And to add to what you were mentioning about the virus particles being able to catch on to dust, yes, that's a preliminary study, but we should not worry too much at this stage, because the primary mode of contact for the primary mode of transmission, for this virus is still through droplets, which usually get expelled during cough, sneeze, or sometimes even talking. So if we maintain adequate social distance for now, I think we're all fairly doing our bit to stay protected.
I learned from your book that when you cough, you expel a few thousand droplets at 50 miles per hour. And when you sneeze, you expel tens of thousands of droplets at 200 miles per hour. I mean, that is incredible. It's also really, truly scary. Rajesh, just to continue this conversation, you're talking of temperature. What about humidity? Is that a factor?
Yes.
Because,
yes.
Now with the rains coming in, humidity will of course increase dramatically.
Yes. So the MIT study, the earlier study that I mentioned, seemed to indicate that humidity too would have a negative impact on the virus. But again, when we look at human behavior and what happens with humidity and with rains, it's once again in the opposite direction. I feel a little strange talking to you about this, Anil, because I know from the excellent work that you've done in architecture that you were amongst the first people to be fully aware of human behavior and not isolating it from the structure of buildings. The smoke detectors we have in our building today, the safety measures in high-rise buildings, which we take so much for granted. Not too many people are aware that you, more than anybody else, have been responsible for installing these, because you were aware of how humans would interact with architecture rather than seeing architecture in isolation. So
well,
I'm sure you understand.
Rajesh, it's incredible that you know this, because this is a previous incarnation of mine when I was working in this field. Yes, we did introduce smoke detectors, sprinklers, and the whole lot.
Exactly.
Positive air pressure in staircases, um, not to use lifts, etc., during fires. These were things unknown. But let me tell both of you first, I really should have said this in the beginning, that you brought out an incredibly brilliant book. This book that you've written is fascinating. It is so readable, and it covers such huge ground, and I don't know how you could possibly do it in this short time that you had. Congratulations really to all of you, and I urge everyone listening in to buy a copy, order it online. To repeat, it's called, very simple title, The Coronavirus, What You Need to Know About the Global Pandemic. You've covered 100 years of pandemics, uh, including the Spanish flu, which actually was an American flu, as
Right.
I mentioned. It started in Kansas. And in India, it killed 18 million people. Uh, so we are doing not so badly this time.
True. True. And 18 million people of the population of India at that time. And the population of the world at that time was slightly more than the population of India today. It was 1.8 billion people. And today the population of India is about 1.3 billion people.
Yeah.
So yes, we are doing substantially better. That's for a variety of reasons. First of all, of course, this virus is an entirely different creature compared to that. But we are far better connected today, to say the least. Political action can be coordinated across countries. Science has developed. So there are a variety of reasons why we're doing better. But thank you, Anil, so much, first of all, not just for your generous words regarding the book. I think the fact that you read all of it is in itself the biggest compliment we could get, because I know how prolific a reader you are, not just a writer, and that you found time to go through our book, and I've appreciated it. It means a lot to us coming from someone of your stature.
Thank you so much. Sometimes you pick up a book when you're doing a program like this out of duty because you have to. But then when the book is good, you read it also for pleasure. And this is one of the occasions. Uh, you have a chapter on what happened in Wuhan, and you have a vivid description of the wet market. Uh, for the sake of listeners, Maherra, would you like to say something about that? The wet market. It is really quite horrific what happens.
Yes, so the wet markets in China and a lot of Southeast Asia are known, very well known, for selling not just meat, but they also have live animals, which are often inspected. This comes from the Chinese culture where they believe that the more
Bunker.
fresh the meat is, then the better the nutritious value of it is. And they look at exotic food and consuming various organs of various animals even as treatment and medicine. So they take it very seriously. And in these markets, the Hunan seafood market, where it is believed that the virus first got transmitted from an animal to a human, happened over there. And although it was a seafood market, only later did it get revealed that over 120 various wildlife were also sold at that market. From reptiles to pangolins, which are smuggled from Africa to China and sold over there. So these markets are much like some of the small markets where we have thousands and thousands of little vendors having stalls put together. And over there, not only is cut out meat, slaughtered meat, butchered meat hung up, but you have the live animals there for inspection. There are stray dogs eating away at the remains.
And I think I think I read that these live animals are slaughtered right there and then, and and all the remains lie on the floor for hours on end, and the dogs are eating them and so on.
Yes.
It's truly quite disgusting. But there's a point there which I want to bring up, and Rajesh, you also come in at some point, that the first case in Wuhan was mid-November 2019, right? And the first case outside China, they happened almost simultaneously, was Thailand, Japan, and South Korea in mid-January 20, which means 2 months, November 15, let's say roughly, to January 15. Now, if the Chinese had not pretended this virus was there, would the world have been saved from what we are going through now? Now, this is a very, very serious question. And I think the Chinese have to own up a lot to what we are going through. But I think the 2 month period is quite crucial to this discussion.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, they need to own up a lot, not only to the world, but to their own people. They went beyond not informing people, they silenced the people who made an attempt to inform their families and their colleagues to be careful. And it's important for us to realize, Anil, this is not the first time they've done it. They did it during the previous SARS pandemic, when for 3 months they did not inform the WHO about what was going on, although they were well aware of it. The WHO team came to take a look. They were not permitted to go in and look at what was going on. This time, it took them 3 weeks. On the 31st of December, they kind of let everybody know. But, they didn't let their own people know, leave alone the world. Thousands of Chinese lives would have been saved had they not taken draconian steps to silence people like the doctors who were, telling the world. Actually, they were not even telling the world. They were telling a few of their colleagues and their families that something strange is going on. Please avoid the market.
I have in fact dedicated the book to Dr. Li Wenliang, who
yes,
was the young, one of the two people you dedicated to. The young doctor who warned his colleagues about it, and who the Chinese then muzzled, and the poor man died also of the COVID. But you're saying that they have a history of doing this, and
absolutely.
it is generally connected with the proximity of human beings with animals.
Yes.
I think this has happened in the previous attacks as well. Now, you have quoted the 1958 Nobel Medicine Prize winner, Dr. Joshua Lederberg,
Yes.
who in 1958 said that viruses pose the single biggest threat to man's continued dominance on this planet. So we are talking of what, 40, 60, more than 60 years ago that this was seen as a problem. Now, why has the medical profession not done anything about it?
Well, I would imagine more than 60 years. If you take H.G. Wells as a prophet, and there are people who think he was more than a science fiction writer. So, the War of the Worlds, the end of the book, the viruses saved the planet in that story. The medical profession has taken note of it. There is a conflict of interest when I say that, because I'm part of that profession. But I think the written records will bear us out that scientists, for a very long time, from the end of World War II, actually, so actually even 10 years preceding, this comment, have been warning of communicable diseases, not necessarily viral, but also bacterial, spreading across the world, and how urgent a need it is to attend to them. But they've been ignored by the powers that be. You need funding for this. For a long time, the West believed, erroneously, until AIDS hit them, but until that point, they believed that communicable diseases were diseases of the so-called third world. Their diseases were the non-communicable ones: cancer, diabetes, Alzheimer's, depression. And funding was disproportionately allocated to non-communicable diseases relative to communicable diseases. Despite that, scientists and doctors, time and again, especially when an epidemic hit the world, requested for more funding. You may have seen a speech which I just saw recently,
Sorry?
because it's doing the rounds, you've been aware of it, that even George Bush, who wasn't particularly far-sighted, on reading a book about the Spanish pandemic, gave a speech saying that something like this would happen in future. So a lot of people have been ignored.
Right. So you're saying it's a question really of both politicians, but mainly politicians and the medical profession not giving it enough serious attention till it's almost too late to do something about it, right? Because you're then fighting an emergency battle instead of planning for it. But is it possible to plan for it? I think that's the question going forward, because all right, a vaccine may be found for this particular COVID, and we'll come to that in a minute. But how do you anticipate a future infection? How do you anticipate a future infection? so that you get ready to fight it. Is that at all possible?
Yes, in fact, the WHO, and Maherra, you please feel to butt in because you may have some insights to add to what I'm saying. But the WHO, in preparation for such a scenario, uh, about a decade ago, created the concept of disease X. Disease X is the unknown pandemic that might hit us. It's actually worse than the current pandemic. And in fact, when the COVID-19 pandemic hit us, some people thought maybe this is the disease X that they've been talking about. But I think the preamble to your question, Anil, is very profound. You cannot really fully prepare for a natural disaster. It's like asking, how do you prepare for a tsunami? How do you prepare for an earthquake? You cannot avert these, but there are different levels of preparation. You can prepare for an earthquake, again, architecturally, as has happened in Japan, which has had series of earthquakes. The structure of their housing and their lifestyles are such. They're also prepared for tsunamis, which accompany earthquakes very often. So there can be a level of preparation. Nobody can be fully prepared. We have to acknowledge humbly that the virus is always a couple of steps ahead of us. But yes, accelerating funding for vaccine development, accelerating funding for preventive health measures. Diseases are very often a measure of how people live. There were people who earlier, said tuberculosis is a disease of poverty. It's caused by poverty, not necessarily by a bacterium. So there can be a level of preparation. But Maherra, would you like to add something to what I'm saying?
Yeah, sure. I also feel that it's like we were discussing earlier, it's important to understand where these diseases come from. So now that we know that it is a zoonotic illness that does transfer from animals to humans, we can be a little more watchful of that human animal interaction. We can be a little more watchful of how much we are encroaching the natural spaces which are there and eating into wildlife. We can be more careful and have a lot more public awareness about health and hygiene measures. And in that sense, I feel South Korea has proved a great example that if you have dealt with something like this, not just their governments, their citizens, without a governmentally enforced lockdown, took the initiative, took the precautions, and really empowered themselves to handle a situation like this. And I feel if awareness is going to be one great key for this. I think if something like this were to come a second time around, definitely we are going to be more aware and more prepared.
Right. Uh, of course, the question everyone's asking, and I've seen one or two questions coming up, are, is there a vaccine happening now? And how soon? For COVID-19.
Yeah.
Will we have a vaccine soon?
The first part of the question is easy to answer. Yes, there's a lot happening. There are at least 6, if not 7 vaccines in various stages of development across the world. How soon? We can tell you how not soon. It will take at least 6 months, if not a year, for the vaccine to be developed. Vaccine development follows certain stages, stage 1, 2, 3, 4. Some of these can be eliminated in an emergency. But Anil, the real big challenge is not having the vaccine. It's to scale up production. It's to ensure equitable distribution and, of course, administration. We're going to need 6 or 7 billion doses of this vaccine. And if we continue with our pattern of behavior, where the wealthy will have access to the vaccine before the poor, where the United States will have access to the vaccine before Zimbabwe, then it's going to be a disaster again, because the virus is going to come around. We've used this phrase in the book, that as long as one person is unsafe, all of us are unsafe. And our behavior, even now, even as it is happening, we don't seem to be learning. A few weeks ago, the United States, led by their president, tried to buy up a vaccine company in Germany, which was showing, there was promise of some vaccine. They wanted to buy up the whole company so that all the vaccines would go to the United States and nowhere else. Of course, the government had not agreed, but there was tremendous opposition from people threatening their own government that you cannot do this, and it did not happen. So I think if we can scale up production and ensure equitable distribution, then we have something going.
Asking this, and this is a question again, as I said, is central to everyone. So this process of getting a vaccine cannot be accelerated so that we have it in 3 or 4 months.
Uh, I don't know what Maherra thinks about it, but I am skeptical that we'll get it that soon. However, it can be accelerated, yes. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation has already got 7 factories ready for production. They are beginning production on the 7 vaccines that are under development. It's likely that maybe one of these 7 or maybe 2 of these 7 might be shown to have some clinical efficacy, in which case they'll turn the production around in the other factories and produce the vaccines that work. So that is, far-sightedness in accelerating for preparation. They're also making preparations for distribution and all of that. But, from what I've read.
Is that all over the world? Distribution all
Yes.
over the world?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, that's what they're doing. I mean, this is not government, this is non-government. But from what I've read of vaccine development, it's the nature of the process that I doubt we'll have something ready to work in 3 months.
Okay. So you're saying 6 months is a minimum?
That's what well, actually, it's not what I'm saying, it's what the experts are saying. I'm just paraphrasing what they're saying.
Okay. In the meantime, how effective is hydrochloroquine, and which is the anti-malarial drug, which has been touted as not as a prophylactic, but as a treatment for people who already have it?
Not effective. Not very effective according to the latest data. It was blown out of proportion to begin with. It started with a small trial in Marseille, in France, and it was done on a small number of patients. There were numerous limitations to the study, which we needn't go into, but we must acknowledge that the authors themselves, as good researchers usually do, highlighted the limitations of the study. Where it went out of hand is where the US president, announced that there was a game changer on hand, to quote his words, and that resulted in his enablers, his scientific enablers, if not openly dissenting against him, at least being silent, and in that agreeing with him. And it resulted in a lot of tragedies, Anil. There were people who landed up in Nigeria in ICUs because hydroxychloroquine is freely available there to combat malaria. There were a couple of deaths. And then some of the data that emerged seemed to be supporting it. It was still a bit premature. It was not compelling. It was not clear. But, in times like this, we all want hope. We want to clutch at straws.
Yes.
And some scientists got drawn into it. But data from just about this past week, both from the NIH and European agency, now clearly indicates that it is not the panacea that people were hoping it would be.
Okay. Now, there's a lot of talk about herd immunity. And Boris Johnson, very famously, the UK Prime Minister, believed in herd immunity, and it delayed in taking any lockdown decision because he thought the population would develop an immunity. And of course, he himself landed in the ICU. So what do you say about herd immunity, number one? And number two, how do you explain India's figures? I think that's a very important question. Of course, we could be underreporting hugely because we're not testing enough. But even then, the number of cases that we have in this country is so small compared to our population and compared to what the rest of the world has experienced, that it is something which, to me, is unexplainable. So maybe you can explain it.
So both of those questions are interesting. Herd immunity as a theoretical construct is academically interesting. In terms of its application, it's almost Darwinian in its cruelty, which is survival of the fittest. What is implicit in the concept of herd immunity is let the illness spread around. People who are not fit will not survive. That includes elderly people, that includes people who already have heart disease and diabetes and numerous other disorders. So after a certain number of people have died, then the balance that is left, and we don't know what that number is, but they say that maybe around 95, 97% of the population that survives it. And 3% is a huge number, even in a country like India, leave alone the world, that these people will have immunity in themselves. And Boris Johnson, subscribed to that theory. And as you pointed out, it was just tragic that the first victim of the theory was himself. For 2 days, he was hovering in the ICU. People didn't know whether he would survive. But once he's come out of the ICU, he's grateful to science and to the doctors, and has not been talking about herd immunity. Herd immunity is a natural process that occurs, but I think to accelerate that process by allowing a large number of people to die, particularly the elderly and the impoverished, is bizarre and cruel. And your second question as to the low numbers in India.
No, absolutely. I agree with you. But sorry, is herd immunity actually a possibility?
Of course.
Does that actually happen?
Of course.
It does. Okay.
Throughout the history, not just in humans, but in animals. And, we have euphemisms for that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Words like trimming the herd and all of that. But I think to its bare, meaning, it comes that, a certain number of people die so that the others can survive and thrive.
Okay. Now let's come to India. What explains our very, very small numbers of people affected by COVID?
Okay. There are numerous theories. Perhaps all of them are valid to some degree. And there are only degrees of probability in these theories. So they're not necessarily in the order that I'm mentioning. One theory going around is that almost all Indians have been immunized against tuberculosis with the BCG vaccine. We all
Right.
probably have little marks on our shoulders or thighs, of that vaccine.
That's for smallpox, I thought.
BCG, it's a Bacille Camille Guarin, and I think it was for tuberculosis. Anil, there is another smallpox vaccine,
Yeah.
but I think BCG. I'll check that and I'll get back to you.
Yeah.
But we've all been immunized with BCG, and that may confer some immunity on us, at least as indicated in the laboratory studies. So that may be a possibility. There are other genetic explanations. There is also the explanation of the early lockdown. We took stringent action. I think I would attribute a lot of the success to that, because that has been proven in Wuhan and everywhere else. So that may certainly be a factor. And there are numerous other theories. What you mentioned and alluded to is about testing and reporting. Our testing is ramped up right now. So I'm not sure that that's a considerable variance in the low rates.
Yeah. Now the lockdown, which you talked about, of course, that was a very good decision that the government did very, very early on. But that lockdown really applies to people like you and me who have the luxury of having our own apartments. But for a large number of Indians, social distancing just does not exist. So the lockdown, what does it mean in a place like Dharavi? What does it mean for migrant laborers? They are together, they're herded together, they are very open to infection. So in spite of that, why are our numbers so low?
I think for some of the other factors,
yeah.
I would imagine for some of the other factors that we mentioned, each of these accounts for a certain degree of the variance in the low numbers. And there may be factors that we've not even thought about as yet, which as science progresses, we might by and by discover them. So there is no complete explanation. But I think we can take solace in the fact that our figures are good and that we are beginning to show some trend of, flattening the so-called curve. And we, like the virus, we may not fully understand for quite some time as to what are the other variables which are influencing the spread of the disease.
There's also a theory that maybe because India has a younger population, that has something to do with it.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that's a demographic thing. I should have mentioned that. But, we are also seeing that young people are dying.
Yeah.
There's also recent data, troubling data coming just 2 days ago from the West, which is showing that while younger people are not dying, I'm talking about people in their 40s, they're developing strokes, they're developing other problems. This is emergent data. It's not fully compiled as yet. These are early warning signs. So there may be many different things that are happening, and not to forget ever that even as we speak, the virus could be mutating. It has already mutated into 3 strains, A, B, and C. They're not necessarily all very lethal, but I mean, relative to each other. But there's always the possibility of a mutation in the virus and things not going according to the plans that we make.
Okay. Maherra, where are you? Maherra has disappeared. Can you join in? And Sahil, can you enable Maherra to join in, please? Because I want to
iPad.
I want to get on to the question of what happens afterwards, post COVID. What happens? Uh, I think you were talking of future killers, which you did mention just a little while back. But what about the psychological effects on people of what we are going through now? You're a clinical psychiatrist, so I think you should know about this. A neuropsychiatrist. Is it something that is going to cause widespread trauma in people? Rajesh?
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I was just double checking, Anil. I was a bit rattled to think that I had kind of gone a little awry on my medical fact. So Bacille Camat Guarin has actually been around for 8 years for tuberculosis.
Yeah.
So I'm just slightly relieved. But sorry, I mean that I missed your question because I was checking on my iPad.
Yes, I was asking about the psychological trauma that I suppose we are all experiencing, of a feeling of dread, this unseen enemy which is all over the world and which we can't do anything about. We are going around wearing masks and gloves, not touching things. It's a very, very awful feeling, and we are doing this every day. So when will things be normal? Will we ever get to a stage of normalcy in the future, or will we stay away from each other? We will not go into gatherings. We will not go into meetings. We will not go to the cinema. We will not go to malls. Is that going to happen?
Well, these are very profound. These are very profound philosophical and sociological questions, and I'm not surprised that they are on your mind. First of all, let us acknowledge what we don't know. We are amidst a bizarre and cruel experiment that is happening. We have nothing to compare it to. So there will be psychological consequences, as have been in the past, but there has never been anything on this scale. Even though the Spanish flu or American flu pandemic may have been larger in terms of its impact, this kind of lockdown, the kind of situation that we are in, has never occurred in the history of mankind. It has been predicted that the next epidemic is going to be a mental health epidemic. So people who are already looking at the data expect, post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, depression. As a neuropsychiatrist, I can just add something which not too many people know about. One of the founding areas of research for neuropsychiatry was what happened after the Spanish flu. After the Spanish flu, people started developing all kinds of neurological and psychiatric disorders, including obsessive compulsive disorder and behavioral disorders. And when autopsies were done on these patients when they died, they found that an area of the brain, the basal ganglia, these are areas in the brain which control a lot of our movement. They're implicated in Parkinson's disease. In fact, there was a surge in Parkinson's disease following the Spanish flu. And they found that there was actually a neurological basis for the changes in human behavior. And that was one of the founding pillars of neuropsychiatry. We started looking at mental disorders, not just in the Freudian way of what happened in childhood and other experiences, but also in terms of changes in the brain. Now, interestingly enough, data from the last 2 days is showing strokes. I did most of my substantial research in the area of post-stroke mood disorders, that when a certain part of the brain, say the left frontal lobe, gets hit, how does it cause depression? What are the effects of different parts of the brain on thinking, mood, behavior? So undoubtedly, there are going to be changes. What those changes are, we will only have to research them and study them. There is going to be a lot of work to do after this. But the second part of your question, normalcy, there is obviously going to be a new normal. We are a problem solving and an adaptive species. That's why we've dominated all other species on the planet. Right. We will learn. We will change our way of thinking. A lot of people, including me, looked upon social media as a problem. We thought it was a addiction. Some of us, and I think I might count you in that majority, who love books, who love the feel of paper, the smell of paper, who are passionate about the written word, did not adapt so easily. I didn't possess a cell phone until recently. I thought a cell phone was a tremendous intrusion on privacy, thinking time, talking to patients. Now that very phone allows me to talk to you. It allows me to deal with my patients. So there is, to use a cliche, a paradigm shift in the way we are going to look at technology. It is now an enabler. Google can tell us the hotspots, what movements are. So I think that is going to change. We're probably going to look at newspapers very differently than we did earlier. And I think the nature of human interaction will undoubtedly change. So there are going to be changes, and but I'm confident that most of us will adapt to them.
But by and large, I think we are social animals, and I think we like to meet people. We like to interact with people. I don't think that's going to change profoundly. We may be a little more careful, but I don't think we're going to go into isolation.
Oh, you're absolutely right. I mean, the big epidemic in the West now, and they actually call it an epidemic, is loneliness. And numerous studies have demonstrated that longevity, happiness, and various other factors are determined by the degree of our social contact. So yes, we will need each other. We will need to touch each other, not just symbolically or spiritually, but physically. And, but I think there's going to be a change, Anil. I just sense it happening. I hope I'm wrong, but I think of the nature of our interactions is going to change. Social scientists in the US said maybe the handshake won't come back for a couple of years. And I looked up on the history of the handshake, and as I'm sure you're aware, it has a very interesting history. 200 years ago, people pulled out their right hand and put it forward to indicate that they were not carrying a concealed weapon and no violence was intended towards the other person. Now we may withdraw that hand to indicate there's no biological violence intended towards the person in front of us. So there are changes occurring. And I think we are, I shouldn't use the word interesting, but I'm compelled to do that. We're in the midst of a very different, but nonetheless interesting time in the history of our species.
Right. The handshake did give an advantage to left-handers, didn't it?
It did, yes.
Yeah, right.
Maladroit. The French word is maladroit, which we use in English now to indicate somebody who's, clumsy.
Right, of course. In the book, you also talk of conspiracy theories. You have a whole chapter on that. And it's a fact that China had a biological weapons program, which they're supposed to have discontinued. But as recently as August of last year, the US said that there is no evidence that this program has been discontinued. Now, that is a conspiracy theory which is very, very widespread. That China didn't do this deliberately, but that this virus escaped.
Maherra, would you like to talk about it? Because Maherra has written that chapter.
Okay.
She's the conspiracy theory expert amongst the three of us. Okay. But, just
Maherra has disappeared, I think. Maherra has gone off. She's not come back. I don't have the number. Rajesh, do you have her number?
I can.
Just can you call her? Can you just ring her up?
I now have one cell phone in life. I'm not sure how to call her while here, but Sahil may be able to do it. I assume you would have her number. And Sahil. I don't. Sahil, can you connect to her? Because I'll have to disconnect to call her. But I could answer that. If you
Um,
just like the flow of the conversation,
I
I could
don't
answer
have her
that.
number, so I've messaged Swappy and I'm waiting for him to reply to me with her number. And I've emailed her as well, so I'm hoping she sees it and joins soon.
Okay.
Yeah, she will, but I could answer that till then.
So Rajesh,
Because
just
I
please.
I have some vicarious knowledge from Maherra's writing.
Yeah.
She wrote the chapter on conspiracy theories,
Yeah.
and well, she's kind of debunked this theory because it seems a bit bizarre. First of all, the genetic analysis of the virus doesn't seem to indicate at all, as of now, that it's been genetically engineered. Most of it, about 88% of it, comes from the bat coronavirus. So that's one thing that does indicate that it may not have been manufactured in China. But now it's becoming politically expedient. Just this morning, I read in the New York Times that the Republican think tanks have advised President Trump and the Republican leadership that one way in which they could deflect attention from their inaction is to blame China for everything, create an anti-China sentiment, and ride it through November. Can you hear me, Anil?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. So, and they're saying that, and to add to that, or maybe it's independent of that and not a coincidence, but a very high-ranking official in the armed forces, I forget his title and his name, also very recently, about a week ago, indicated that we have not ruled out the possibility that this could have been manufactured in China. So there may be compelling political reasons to keep that narrative alive, but there doesn't seem to be any scientific evidence to indicate that the Chinese manufactured it. They can be accused of a lot of other things which are terrible, but I'm not so sure whether the accusation that they manufactured it and deliberately or accidentally set it loose in Wuhan is, I think, as of now, unsubstantiated.
Okay, to just take that question a bit further, let us assume that the Chinese have not manufactured this particular virus, but one is quite sure that many countries in the world have labs which prepare for biological warfare, including, I'm sure, the United States.
Absolutely.
So what is the possibility of viruses or some kind of germs escaping in the future?
Oh, that's definitely possible. I'm not sure how probable it is, but it's definitely possible because there are different levels of security in these labs, and these are level flow high security labs. But the virus is absolutely invisible. It can sneak out in a variety of ways, and no matter how careful we are, I mean, look what happened in Chernobyl. What happened on 3 Mile Island many years ago. These are very highly secure nuclear facilities, and things can go wrong. And I think this should be a humbling lesson to all of us. We need to suspend these programs. I cannot understand in today's world how a country that accuses and wrongly and falsely accuses another nation of weapons of mass destruction and uses it as a reason or an excuse for a ill-planned invasion can itself maintain a biological weapons program and yet with a straight face lecture the whole world on its dangers. So I think we have to learn. These have to be abandoned. They don't help us.
Yeah. So you also have a chapter on the economics, how COVID will affect the economics of the world. And you also have a chapter on social media. Economics is something I think we won't touch upon today because it's a huge field and I think it needs an economist to join us also. But social media, people say, has aggravated this particular uh, COVID, the effects of COVID. It, uh, just before you joined, there was a friend who came on this program and she said, why is the media causing so much damage? So the feeling is that we've had infections before, we have had a lot of epidemics, not many pandemics maybe, but because social media is so widespread now, this particular feeling of terror has been accentuated. What do you think of this?
Well, I think as we've pointed out in the beginning of the chapter on social media, that social media at the end of the day is a tool. It is humans who use it. And, we should need to look at ourselves rather than blame an abstract concept of social media. We need to also, in all fairness, examine the tremendous benefit that social media has brought to all of us in these terrible times. It allows us to be connected, one. Okay, we talk, in fact, in the book, we've, highlighted a point of view, and it's a semantic point of view, but I think you'll agree with me that even using social distancing is an inappropriate term. We should be talking of physical distancing. That's what we want. We are all socially connected thanks to social media. Social media has enabled us to track this. And I too was, I must confess, amongst those who looked at these behemoths, whether it is not so much Google, but say, what is that, Facebook and various other things as encroaching on our privacy, tracking us to enable commerce. But these are the people who have come to our rescue. These are the people who are now diverting a lot of their efforts to deal with the disease. Let us not neglect that. We are looking at silly WhatsApp messages and, getting troubled by that. But there's a lot going on in social media, which is being very effectively harnessed to contain the disease.
Right, and as doctors, you are in, I think, more immediate touch with other doctors around the world on this. And I believe when doctors and researchers have a finding, they immediately post it so that everyone can see, which wouldn't have happened before.
Oh, it used to be a very competitive field before. It was highly competitive. We kept it to ourselves. We wanted to be the first. That seems to have entirely been eradicated now. We are ready to share. We're ready to chat. And social media makes it possible. So, it's a question of shooting the messenger. And it's ironic that we should be using social media to condemn it.
Yeah. Hi, Maherra. You come back. You disappeared.
Yes. All right. I'm so sorry. I got the message that the meeting had ended, and then.
No, what happened was that we suddenly had this intrusion, shall we say, a hacker coming in.
Yes.
Then we managed to restart. And okay, now there's a question about this. When the vaccine does come up, as we hope soon, will that give long-term immunity? Like we had polio shots and we had BCG shots and we had smallpox inoculations, etc., which gave you lifelong immunity. Is that likely to happen with a vaccine when and if it comes up?
Right now, we know because we are still learning more about the virus. Just recently, a day or two back, I got to know that there are various strains, at least 30 strains of the virus that have been already identified. The vaccine that is usually created against the virus will be against a specific mutation. Now, like in the past, we have the common, the common cold which comes back to us every year. For that, the virus mutates, influenza mutates so quickly that they need to come up with a new vaccination predicting the mutations on a yearly basis. For something like you mentioned, for polio or for measles, you're taking a shot for once in a lifetime, and that keeps you fairly protected throughout. So how long the vaccine is going to keep us protected is going to depend on how quickly this virus mutates and how it tends to infect us. And with the way it's seemingly right now, that although the virus is mutating, the way it's attacking the host cell seems to be fairly around the same. So I think if a vaccine comes in, we should be fairly okay, but it's too early to tell yet.
Rajesh, do you want to add to that?
No, I think I reiterate what Maherra is saying, and what seems more likely, almost probable, is that we'll need this vaccine over and over again. The flu shots have to be taken every year because the virus mutates annually, and it's actually a game of predicting it and trying to match it. It has been said by experts that it's possible. One of the high possibilities is that the virus may go away for a while and come back even 4 or 5 years later in a different avatar. So it looks more likely that we are going to have different types of vaccines frequently rather than a single vaccine. Having said that, let me contradict myself a bit now, because we've also stated this in the book, that we may come to a time with the way developments are going, that we may actually have a universal vaccine for various diseases. And there is some indication that that work is hoping. That would be tremendous. I mean, that's going to be a great thing.
So one shot to cure all.
Right. That's right.
Okay.
Yeah.
But you also talked about different coronaviruses, the alpha, beta, gamma, and delta.
Right.
And you have talked of a kind of a natural selection amongst viruses.
Yes.
The Darwinian theory applying to viruses, which sounds amusing, but it also sounds pretty deadly.
Yeah.
So now is the only cure really is prevention in the long term. So as a first step to get rid of the wet markets, which I think is the cause of this, and have been the cause of other viruses which have come before. Is that right? Prevention right at the source of the problem?
Yes, I mean, that is so clearly plausible. But, it's sad, the wet markets have started again in China. Right now, even as we speak, the wet markets have started again in China. I think it's also a larger thing, and that's the interaction between us and our other animals. We are a species, and I think we've become a very arrogant species. We are invading the territory of other species. We have become unbelievably cruel over the years in the way we are treating animals, herding them and actually kind of putting them in factory-like environments to produce them. And I think we will have to change that way of being. Aside from all this, one of the lessons we've learned is what's happening with the environment right now. But, one of the major causes of environmental problems is the methane released by animals, cows, goats, etc., who are, kept for human consumption. So I think we will need to unilaterally negotiate, because the animals don't have a choice in this. But we will have to rework our terms of coexistence with other species on this planet out of enlightened self-interest, rather than worrying about the taste of the next burger somebody is about to have at McDonald's.
And I think vegetarianism may become more widespread because of this.
It's already becoming. It's already happening regardless.
Yeah. So I hope that is one of the positive things. And I hope we have more respect for the environment going forward as a result of what has happened. With that, I think I will end. And thank you, Rajesh. Thank you, Maherra, for a most enlightening conversation. And to all of you here, you must get this book. It's available. I'm sure you can order it online. It is a really wonderful book, which is not just about this virus, but gives a whole history of pandemics and talks about the future also. Thank you again, Maherra, Rajesh, for being here.
Thank you, Anil. Thank you,
you
Anil,
so
for
much.
having us. It's been a privilege to be with you. It's been a privilege to enjoy this discussion. And thank you for your kind and generous words about the book.